Hey everybody, welcome back. I know a lot of you are really interested in how relationships are changing these days, and especially all this talk about cohabitation. So we're going to take a deep dive into that today. Really looking at how living together before marriage is kind of reshaping the whole landscape of relationships. We're going to be using excerpts from a proposed podcast called Cohabitation, a new era of love and living together. And one of the things that really jumped out at me was this statistic that a majority of couples now are actually living together before they get married. It's pretty amazing when you think about it.
It really is. Yeah, it's a huge shift from just
Well,
my generation or two ago.
I know it was like a total 180. I mean, it used to be like if you lived together before you were married, that was like, whoa, scandalous.
No, absolutely. Yeah, it was really seen as taboo, totally outside the societal norms. Marriage was like the foundation, the bedrock of stability and respectability, the only acceptable path.
Yeah. So what happened? Like what caused this massive shift?
Well, I think it's a couple of things. For one, divorce rates started going up, and then traditional gender roles started to change. And also economics shifted and,
Right.
made it more feasible for couples to live together without necessarily being married.
Oh, interesting. So it's kind of like all these different forces coming together.
Yeah, there was like a growing emphasis on like individualism and personal choice.
Right. Like do your own thing. It's not like the old way anymore.
Exactly. People were starting to question whether marriage was really the only way to commit, and have a family. And that kind of opened the door for cohabitation to become more widely accepted.
Right. It makes total sense. So would you say that these changing views on marriage, like marriage itself, are a big part of why we're seeing more cohabitation?
I think so. Yeah, without a doubt. I think there are two big trends. One, marriage is not seen as a requirement to start a family anymore. And two, younger generations see marriage as like a choice, not an obligation.
So instead of feeling like, oh, I got to get married, it's more like, let's try this out first.
Exactly. They want to test the waters, see if they're really compatible in a day-to-day kind of setting without all the legal ties of marriage.
Yeah, like without signing on the dotted line, you can sort of see if you really click.
Right. You can see like how you handle your money together, how you communicate, even like who does the dishes.
Yeah, like all that nitty-gritty stuff that you don't really think about until you're living together.
Exactly. It really gives you a glimpse into what a shared future might look like.
So it's kind of like a test drive before you make a bigger commitment. But is it just a test drive? Or could it be the commitment itself?
That's a great question. I think for some people, cohabitation is a genuine commitment. It's like a different way of doing things, moving away from those traditional norms. They might build a life together, have kids, and everything, all without getting a marriage license.
Yeah, interesting. Our source material actually mentions that. Some couples specifically choose cohabitation because they don't want all that pressure and expectations that come with a big wedding.
It can be a lot. All that planning and the ceremony and the guests and everything.
Yeah, for some people, that's not their style. It's more about creating a commitment. That feels right for them.
Exactly. It's not necessarily about saying no to marriage. It's about doing what works for you, whether it's waiting to get married or choosing not to get married at all. The bottom line is people want flexibility, and they want to define their relationships on their own terms.
So it's not one size fits all anymore. It's more like create your own adventure.
Yeah, exactly. It's about what works for you and your partner.
So besides sort of testing the waters in a relationship, what are some of the practical reasons why people choose cohabitation these days?
Well, money is a big one. Sharing the bills, especially with everything getting so expensive.
Yeah, it makes sense. Everything's going up, up, up. Rent, groceries, it can be a lot to handle.
Right. So splitting those costs can be a huge help.
Right. And it's just easier in general,
It is. Sharing those everyday things like chores and meals. And just being in each other's space can make life a lot smoother.
Yeah. And plus, it's nice to be with the person you love right there all the time.
Exactly. And that closeness can help you figure out what it would be like to build a future together.
So it's not just about saving money. It's about getting a preview of what life together could be.
Exactly.
So is this trend of living together before marriage, is that mainly a Western thing? Or are we seeing it all over the world?
That's a good question. And it brings up an important point. While it's more common in the West, where people are really big on individualism and making their own choices, it's actually becoming more common everywhere.
Wow. Even cultures where marriage has always been the norm.
Yep. Even there.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
So it seems like these changing ideas about marriage and commitment are kind of breaking down cultural
It
barriers.
seems like it. People all over the world are starting to question the old ways of doing things.
So are the reasons for living together pretty much the same everywhere?
Right.
Or are there like cultural differences?
Well, yeah, I mean, like we talked about, money's a factor almost everywhere, and so is wanting to see if you're compatible. But there are definitely cultural things to keep in mind. Like, for instance, in some countries, the marriage laws are super complicated and expensive.
Oh, wow. So living together first is a way to kind of sidestep all that.
Exactly. It's a more practical way to start building a life together.
I see. So sometimes it's about navigating those legal and social hurdles. But are there ever cases where like cultural values actually clash with the whole idea of living together before marriage?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, while it's becoming more accepted overall,
There are still places where it's not really okay.
in some cultures, marriage is like the only acceptable way to be in a relationship. And living together before marriage would be seen as like breaking the rules.
So even though we're seeing this global shift, it's important to remember that cultural norms and values still matter.
They do. They play a big role
Yeah.
in how people see cohabitation.
Right. So it's not as simple as just saying everyone's doing it now.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
more complicated than that.
It's a really complex issue
Mm-hmm.
with all these different layers. Cultural, societal?
Personal.
It's fascinating. And in the next part, we're going to dig even deeper into those cultural differences. So stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everybody. We're continuing our deep dive into cohabitation. And in the last part, we talked about, all those big societal shifts that are driving this trend of living together before marriage. And we also touched on how views on cohabitation can be really different depending on where you are in the world.
Yeah.
But now I kind of want to get into like the practical stuff. Like for people who are actually thinking about living together, or maybe they've already decided to do it, what are some of the key things they should keep in mind?
Well, I think the first thing is to really understand why you're doing it. Like, what are your motivations? What are you hoping to get out of it?
Right. Like don't just go into it blindly.
Right. Have a clear sense of what you want before you make that leap.
And it's also super important to talk to your partner about it.
Mhm.
Like really have an open and honest conversation.
Absolutely. Make sure you're both on the same page about what you expect from living together.
Right. Like are you both thinking long term? Or is this just a temporary thing? Do you want to get married eventually? Kids? All that stuff.
It's about having those tough conversations up front so you don't run into problems later on.
Yeah, you got to lay a solid foundation
Yeah,
based on, shared expectations.
exactly. And that goes for finances too. I mean, our source material is really stressed how money can be a huge deal in a cohabiting relationship.
Oh, yeah. Money can be a major source of conflict
Yeah,
if you're not careful.
absolutely.
So what should couples be talking about when it comes to finances?
Well, for starters, you got to be clear about how you're going to split expenses. Are you going to have a joint account? How are you going to handle debt? Things like that.
It's like you need to create a financial roadmap for your
Bef-
life together.
Yeah, exactly. Have a plan so you
Yeah.
can avoid those misunderstandings. That can lead to resentment down the line.
And don't forget about the legal side of things.
Yeah.
Which a lot of people don't even think about.
That's a good point. The legal implications of cohabitation can be pretty significant.
Okay, so legal implications. What does that mean exactly?
Well, unlike marriage, which has a pretty clear legal framework, cohabitation laws can be all over the place depending on where you live, like in some places.
Mhm.
Just living together for a certain amount of time can actually give you certain rights and responsibilities.
Really? So it's not just about like lovey-dovey feelings.
Right. There's a whole legal side to it.
So what are some examples of those legal issues that couples might face?
Well, one big one is property rights. Like if you break up, who gets to keep what? Especially if one person owns the house and the other person's been paying the mortgage or helping with renovations.
Yeah, that could get messy. And what about inheritance? Like if one partner dies?
That's another tricky one. Cohabiting partners don't always have the same inheritance rights as married couples.
Wow, so there's a lot to think about. It's not as straightforward as just moving in together.
Nope, it's definitely worth talking to a lawyer to make sure you're protected.
Good advice. So we've covered the financial and legal stuff. But what about the emotional challenges of cohabitation? Like our source material talked about that a bit. And I'm curious to hear your take.
Sure. I think one of the biggest challenges is just adjusting to each other's habits. Everyone has their own routines, and when you start living together, you have to find a way to make it work.
Yeah, it's like finding that balance
Mm-hmm.
between being an individual and being part of a couple.
Exactly. You're sharing a space, so you got to figure out how to live together
Right.
without driving each other crazy.
Right, like who gets to control the thermostat, who does the dishes, all that stuff. It's like learning to dance together,
Yeah,
but in a really small room.
that's a good analogy. And then there's conflict, which is going to happen in any relationship. But living together can definitely make it more intense.
Oh, yeah, because you can't just walk away. You're kind of stuck there.
Exactly. So you got to learn how to deal with conflict in a healthy way.
So not about avoiding conflict altogether. It's about finding ways to work through it.
Right. Being able to communicate, listen to each other, and find solutions.
So is there like a secret recipe for making cohabitation successful? Like what are the key ingredients?
Well, like we've been talking about, communication is huge. You got to be able to talk to each other about your needs, your expectations, your boundaries, without feeling like you're going to be judged.
Yeah, create that safe space
Mm,
where you can have those tough conversations.
exactly. And respect is super important too. You got to value each other, even when you don't agree.
Right. It's not about trying to change your partner. It's about accepting them for who they are.
Exactly. And respecting their boundaries, even when you're living in the same space.
So how can couples do that? Like, how can they create that respect and balance when they're living together?
Well, one thing is to be clear about who's responsible for what. Like who does the dishes, who takes out the trash, who pays the bills.
Yeah, those everyday things can cause a lot of friction.
If you don't talk about them.
And what about personal boundaries? Like, how do you handle that?
It's about giving each other space, even when you're living together. Like maybe one person needs some quiet time to read or just relax, and the other person wants to be more social. You got to respect those differences.
So you're both happy, even though you're sharing a space.
Exactly.
What else is important for cohabiting couples?
I think having a shared purpose is really important.
What do you mean by that?
It's about having something that you're both working towards, like maybe you want to start a family or buy a house or travel the world. It doesn't really matter what it is, as long as you're both excited about it.
So it's like having a shared dream that keeps you motivated.
Exactly. It gives you something to look forward to, and it helps you get through the tough times.
That makes sense. So now I want to talk about the big picture. Like, what does all this mean for the future of relationships? Is marriage becoming obsolete? Is cohabitation the new normal? Let's explore those questions. In the final part of our deep dive. Welcome back to the show, everyone. So we've talked about a lot of interesting stuff, like, how society's changing and what it's like to actually live with someone before marriage. But I think the big question on everyone's mind is, what does this all mean for the future of relationships?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It really is. And there's no easy answer. The future's not set in stone.
So no crystal ball for relationships.
I'm afraid not. But we can look at the trends we're seeing now and make some educated guesses.
Okay, so let's do that. Let's talk about some of those possible scenarios. What are some of the long-term effects of all these people living together before marriage?
Well, one thing to think about is, what's going to happen to marriage rates? As cohabitation becomes more and more common, some people might just decide that they don't need to get married.
Yeah. Like if living together works for them, why bother with the whole marriage thing?
Exactly. It's like the lines are getting blurry between cohabitation and marriage. And for some people, that might be perfectly fine. They get the companionship, the commitment, maybe even kids, without all the legal and social baggage that comes with marriage.
Right. Our source material actually mentions a study where a lot of couples who are living together said they were perfectly happy with their situation and had no plans to get married. It really shows that. People are choosing what works best for them, not just following the old rules.
Exactly. It's about personalizing your relationship, making it your own.
I think that's great. It's all about freedom of choice. Another thing to consider is how cohabitation might change our ideas about family. As more people live together and have kids without being married.
We might see a wider variety of family structures.
Yeah, it's not just the traditional nuclear family anymore. It's like the definition of family is expanding.
Exactly. And that could have a big impact on things like social policies and laws.
Right, like parental rights,
Yeah.
inheritance.
All that stuff might need to be updated to reflect these new kinds of families.
It's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.
It is. It's like we're witnessing a major shift in how we view relationships and family.
And it's happening right before our eyes, so we can't say for sure what the future holds. But one thing's for sure. The landscape of relationships is definitely changing.
It is. And cohabitation is a big part of that change.
So as we wrap up our deep dive, what advice would you give to our listeners who are trying to figure all this out?
I think the most important thing is to be open and honest with your partner, whether you're thinking about living together, getting married, or something else entirely. Communication is key.
It's about being proactive, not just letting things happen.
Exactly. It's about making conscious choices about your relationship and creating something that truly reflects your values and goals.
So in this new world of relationships, what's the most important thing to remember?
I would say there's no right or wrong answer. What matters is finding a path that brings you and your partner happiness and fulfillment and a sense of shared purpose.
It's about creating a relationship that's authentic and meaningful, whether it fits the traditional mold or not.
Exactly. It's your journey. Make it your own.
So as we close, I just want to leave our listeners with this thought. The future of relationships is in our hands. The choices we make today will shape how people connect and love for generations to come.
That's a powerful message, and it's a reminder that we have the power to create the kind of world we want to live in.
A world where love and respect are the guiding principles. And with that, we come to the end of our deep dive into cohabitation. Thanks for joining us, and we hope you found this exploration insightful and thought-provoking. Keep those conversations going, and keep creating relationships that bring you joy and meaning. Thanks for listening.